Hey everyone, and welcome back to IDEANTHRO Movement and Water. Yep, it is a joint episode. On today's episode, why cueing optimal shoulder position is a problem and makes the situation more complex. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is this a joint episode? That sounds decidedly movementy. I'm here for water. Why are we talking about shoulders? Because there's a principle that I believe I first raised on IDEANTHRO Water back in episode 237. I think that's when it came up. There's a lot of episodes out there at the moment, but I think that's when it came up. And this is a principle that I believe, the principle that I raised there in a water context to something that's kind of going wrong in our approach to water-sensitive urban design, is fundamentally the same principle that we've got going wrong here in this movement context with respect to cueing an optimal shoulder position, or really any optimal bodily position when there's a problem, when we're kind of badly out of position, right? So I'm going to use this episode to highlight the similarity, because the actual takeaway here is the fact that this is a systemic mistake in our thought process and our response to dealing with complex systems. So if we can learn the principle, then not only can we potentially apply it in the movement context with respect to a shoulder that I'll talk about, or water-sensitive urban design that I'll talk about, but we can try and look for and make sure we don't fall into this trap in other aspects of our life. Because sure as heck, the same thing plays out, for example, in the food eating diet world. What am I trying to say? Nutrition. Nutrition's the spot that I wanted to find that, but I'm not going to talk about that. So what's this pattern? I'm going to talk about it first in the water context. I've mentioned it's something about shoulders, but let's explain it in the water context here. So concept called water-sensitive urban design, which for the movement people is essentially how we design cities so we don't screw up our water cycle, so we can afford to supply water in the future, so we have nice waterways, we don't pollute them, we don't damage them. One of the ways that you can look at water in cities, a conceptual framework for this, is a diagram that was produced by Rebecca Brown, which essentially shows the transition of cities through different cycles of different aspects of the water cycle and the extent to which they manage water. So a city's settled, and the first thing you need to do is supply the city with water for drinking. So you can have a water supply city. But that's not really enough, because people pretty quickly work out that, hey, you know what? We're supplying all this water, and if we have a bunch of wastewater, and you know what? Just dumping it out on the streets is not really a great idea. So maybe we need to do something with that. We need to manage our wastewater. So then you can get a wastewater management city. And then you find that people figure out that, hey, you know what? Paving our cities with putting roofs over our heads and paving the streets so we can get around, that has some problems. It causes some flooding. Okay, that's a bit of an issue. Let's manage that. Let's now start to put in a stormwater network to convey stormwater flows away. And so on and so on and so on. Now, the challenge here is that when we've made attempts to do things in those states, we also inadvertently have inappropriate consequences flow on from it. It's in solving that in that way, oops, we actually caused that other thing. So let's look at the stormwater example. So in needing a roof over our heads and needing roads to optimally get around on, we accidentally make flooding worse, because more water hits impervious surfaces, doesn't infiltrate into the ground, but runs off quickly to our waterways, so more water gets to our waterways, and in big rainfall events, they're more likely to flood. So floods become more common and more damaging. So we decide to, hey, you know what? Let's try and get that waterway as efficiently as possible. So we decide to build really efficient pipe networks, stormwater networks. It gets water quickly into those waterways and quickly out to sea where it's away from us. Well, that has some unintended consequences, because we're changing the timing of flooding. So while it might make flooding better in one spot, it can make it worse in another. It also turns out that delivering a lot of water really, really quickly to our waterways erodes them, it screws them up and damages them ecologically. So then we come along with the concept of, okay, we've got this water-sensitive urban design concept. So let's now build these things called bioretention systems, which store water in the landscape and hold it there and infiltrate it into the soil. They treat it to remove pollutants from it, because, by the way, building a whole bunch of roads and running cars around on them and roofs and a whole bunch of stuff, also means more pollution gets to our waterways. So let's treat the water with these bioretention systems. They'll also infiltrate some into the ground, so not as much get to the waterways. So we don't have to deal with some of these flooding issues. But oh, by the way, they cost a heap. And by the way, they're actually kind of resource intensive. But digging up a whole bunch of river sand and making a filter media from it, that's not exactly sustainable. It costs a lot. It makes infrastructure management in our cities more expensive. So what's this next thing that we can do to... Can you see how every step that we take, the pattern that we're looking at here, in an attempt to solve the last problem, we have several follow-on other problems that we then need to solve that inherently, and this is the pattern, make things more and more and more and more complex. The system gets harder. We actually get further away from a nice succinct solution. We actually just make stuff harder for ourselves. And you could extrapolate that eventually, if that keeps going on, there has to be a breaking point where the system just falls apart, right? So the principle here, and this is what I've talked about previously, the principle here is that if you actually want to solve these problems, you have to stop adding this complexity to the system. You have to stop solving these things by tacking something on, right? You actually have to go back, okay, so the fundamental problem here is that we've built a lot of roofs and roads and a stormwater network that really quickly delivers water away. Okay, so we need to stop that. And the bioretention system does stop that, but it does it by tacking something else on. Why don't we just try and find ways to stop that happening in the first place? That's the thought process. Now, the actual answer is not that easy, right? But the thought process is definitely the thought process we should be looking at. So let's now take this over to movement. Finally! So coming back to the shoulder situation. So 2 episodes ago on IDEANTHRO Movement, I described to you a situation where I had seen a physical therapy practice make a post on Facebook that essentially advocated that the correct position for the shoulder in all sporting activities or exercises was back and down. Right? Now, I made a bunch of arguments as to why that's not an appropriate position, why that doesn't work for all sporting activities to start with, why there being this one optimal position is not in fact safe across a lifespan. But the point that I'd like to draw out here, I'm going to build upon that, but tackle this in a slightly different way. The point that I'd like to make here is that this is an example of adding complexity into the system. If we're going, right, okay, there's something about this person's shoulder position that we're going to cue this to that we don't like. And let's assume for a minute that there is something wrong with that position. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't in the example that I read out the other day. That's not the point. Let's assume that there is actually something wrong with their shoulder position. And we're going to solve that. We've decided, and again, I don't even agree with this, but just bear with me. I'm just pointing out that there's a fundamental problem in our thought here. And we decided that, hey, we need to get them into this shoulders back and down position because that's the right position. It's not the right position. It's not the only right position. Only right position. We actually need movement variety. We actually need shoulder position variety in our lives, as I demonstrated 2 episodes back. But just for a moment, let's assume that for some bizarre reason, we actually do want to get them into that position as the right position. Let me describe something to you. I have a 1-year-old daughter. When she needs to be, she is inherently in a shoulders back and down position. Absolutely no dramas. Right? She does it naturally when she needs to. And then she moves out of that position when she needs to do something else. Because as it turns out, for different movements, there are different shoulder positions that are appropriate. But when she does need to be in that position, does she think about it and do it consciously? She's 1. Now, to be honest, at 1, kids are pretty smart, right? But she's been doing that position since, like, when she could first sit up. Once the erectors all came on and she was able to sit up months and months and months ago, right? Probably before she said her first words, probably before she started understanding heaps of words, right? Do you think she was sitting there consciously going, that's right, I need to have my shoulders back and down. You know, I've only just learnt to sit up, but I understand this deep concept that the shoulders should be set back in this position. No, she did it naturally. So when we have a situation where someone isn't moving optimally in the way that we want, is the solution that we actually want in the long term for them to be thinking about this consciously? Because here's the thing. I've never come across someone who, through being told to consciously cue any sort of position alone, has then at some point subconsciously inherited that position, right? By doing this thing consciously time and time and time again, has inherited that position, right? I have seen people inherit really much better posture by doing wide and varied complex natural movements and essentially turning back on their body's intrinsic instinctive way of moving, the way my 1-year-old daughter moves. But telling someone to consciously cue the shoulders back and down, no, what that teaches them to do is to consciously cue the shoulders back and down forever, which adds complexity to the system, because suddenly, instead of not having a care in the world about how they moved, right? And when they were younger, as a kid, moving really, really well naturally and instinctively, suddenly we've said, the only way for you to move well is to now consciously think about it. That's added complexity to the system. Can you see how my 1-year-old moves right and doesn't have to think about it? Nice, simple system. And yet we're taking an adult and saying, the way for you to move right is to think about it all the time. What? That's going to put them under constant stress thinking about it. That can have flow-on effects because people pretty quickly make mistakes. And instead of thinking, instead of going, that's the right way, they start accidentally doing too much of it here. They can't quite perceive where they are. They do too much of it. They hold it too tight. It has a whole bunch of other flow-on effects. Can you see how this is the same principle playing out as in the water sector, where one's attempt to solve the problem tacks something else on that makes the world more complex and causes other problems that we then have to tack more onto. And the whole thing just gets out of control. The same thing's going on here if you're cueing back and down, if you're cueing whatever position, right? And thinking that by getting someone into that position, consciously holding it is solving anything. It's not. The correct solution in this analogy here is to figure out how to turn their instinctive correct patterns back on. The reason they've lost their patterns is because of their movement diet throughout their life, their movement nutrition being inappropriately balanced and not matching up with what our bodies inherently expect from us because of how our ancestors evolved. The solution is not for us to take this thing up here and to try and be like, you need to hold your shoulders back like that. No. If you're feeding yourself a constant diet of sitting at a computer or whatever it is that's causing this bad shoulder position, I just picked that because, slumped over all the time, will put the shoulders in a position that these physios whose analogy or whose video ultimately prompted this whole discussion and analogy would suggest that that's probably a bad position. And I would tend to agree if you're doing it all the time. I would not suggest that this is bad position if done for a short period of time right now, or else I wouldn't be doing it. But if done all day, yeah, sure, problems. But the thing here that we're talking about, slightly lost my track there, just highlighting that. But the point here is that this person has ended up in these bad positions. I mean, it could be from a catastrophic injury, right? But the vast majority of the time we see people out of position with funny situations. It's because their movement over the past 5, 10, 20 years has led them to that position through an inappropriately balanced movement diet, right? Has caused this position. If we think that we are going to solve that by then being like, okay, shoulders back, just hold yourself in this position, it ain't gonna work, right? We've got there. The inappropriate movement diet has caused a problem in the system, which has had this result, which we want to fix. The correct way to fix it is not to pull your shoulders back. or to do more exercise to strengthen up the back, if you still have the same fundamental underlying problems in your movement diet, all you're doing is adding more complexity to that system and adding problems into that system that will ultimately cause you other issues down the track. And to tie this back into something we said 2 episodes back, one of the problems in this particular example, but this is just the example that we're using with shoulders back and down, shoulders back and down tenses you up. If you're in a bad position and you try and go shoulders back and down, you will add tension to the system. And if you then try and do any real world movement like running, suddenly you're really tense. Your thoracic spine isn't going to move as it should. You're probably going to find that more of the rotation comes out of the thoracolumbar junction, just at the base of kind of the rib cage area where you go down into your lower back. It's the joint between it's the kind of conceptual joining between the upper back and the lower back. Probably more of that movement will come out of there, which might add extra wear to that joint, might cause stuff like the erectors or the quadratus lumborum to then try and spasm up to control that. A whole bunch of stuff could flow on, right? As opposed to my 1-year-old daughter, who also has shoulders back and down, but has it without any tension. So then her whole spine moves appropriately and everything's good. So the solution here isn't to tack on shoulders back and down, but is to look at what the movement diet is, what the problem, what actually caused this problem in the first place, and then to undo that cause, right? To be like, okay, then this is just an example. You've got this problem because you are slumped over a computer all day, every day. Sweet, no dramas. Let's give you a variety of different ways to sit at that computer. Maybe you're going to stand some of the day. Maybe we're going to give you a few different postures to sit in so that some of the time you could still be a little slumped. But in other times, you're going to be up nice and straight. Maybe for a little bit, you're actually going to be a little rotated, both directions. Maybe we're going to change your hip position here. So you might sit in this slightly different position, which gives a stretch in a particular way. Maybe you might come around, do a different position over here. We're going to give you some variety. And we're also going to do these sorts of things here that change the underlying problem, right? They're not adding complexity to the system. They're stripping away some of the underlying problems and either replacing them so there's no net gain or just stripping things away, right? And so that's the point that we want to get across here. There's a real trap to fall into in any aspect of life when we go, problem, solve it by tacking on. Oh wait, new problem, solved by tacking on again. Oh wait, new problem, solved by tacking on again. We see this play out in our water work and in our movement work. And ultimately, it leads to the system spiraling out of control. In the water world, it'll lead to it getting too complex and too costly for us to manage. In the movement world, we ultimately just push dysfunction around the body. Neither of these situations are desirable. Okay, that is plenty for this episode, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you found this useful or interesting, give us a like or a subscribe. If you'd like to know more about what it is that we do at IDEANTHRO Movement, you can go to ideanthro.com/movement. We have a real world facility. If you'd like to come and train with us, if you'd like to become a member, but want to give it a free go first, you can go to ideanthro.com/free-trial. And if you just want to find out more about what it is we do at IDEANTHRO, you can go to ideanthro.com/connect. By the way, we have a newsletter, so on any of those pages, if you scroll down to the bottom, you can sign up and join the newsletter too. Okie dokie, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.